Thank you for that, Daniel. I also want to pay my respects to elders past and present of these lands and emerging. My name is Jesse John Fleay, but on my ancestral Noongar lands where I was born, I'm known as Walich Mudjalak. I'm a Noongar custodian of knowledge and culture entrusted to me. What was entrusted to me is the nature by which Noongar people govern themselves and cared for the land. I was initiated into the law of my land of birth when I came of age near Kutakitch, a sacred gathering place of our people. Today, it is known by many as Wave Rock in Western Australia. At Kutakitch, I sang out to the land at night, and it sang back to me with the sign of the rising wedge-tail eagle spirit the following afternoon. Noongar people believe in the freedom to exist as we choose, and to ensure that the land and its resources which sustain us remain for many future generations. We care about the future, we plan a great deal about it. Matters such as our Commonwealth Constitution and how we are currently affecting millions of people unborn in anything we do today are matters which are culturally well placed with us. A song of joy and a song of love can prevail across generations from the heart and the sacred ceremonial Nala Kala. These are what our home fires are on country. All decisions, all stories, all governance, nourishment and care occurred by the Nala Kala home fires for over 40,000 years on our Noongar lands. After the land itself initiates us, we walk a biddy, which is a path. I came to be Mudjalak on my biddy. I'm at one with the wisdom and cultural knowledge of the Mudjar tree and its secrets. The Mudjar is more commonly known as the Australian Christmas tree. But for us, it is a sign and symbol of one who is initiated into leadership by the land, purely based on their ability to listen before they speak. Walich and Mudjalak are perhaps the most significant totems of Whadjuk and Bunurong Noongar Budja. Carrying Walich and Mudjalak in my name means my biddy or my path is at one with the prosperity of others, born and unborn. To be Walich Mudjalak is to tell stories so that you may choose to take wisdom from what you hear. If it helps you on your own path, and if you have a strong belief in ethical thought. I tell stories of love and great joy, and I also tell stories of pain and of powerlessness. I believe that truth and justice are the responsibilities and daily commitments to all people, past, present, and emerging. To be Walich Mudjalak is to live with service to others and with purpose, strong in the language and law of our people's wisdom for the sake of future generations. It is a becoming, not a permanent state. It is a lifelong commitment, and there's no room for perfection, only improvement through a person's life. My lands of birth encompass the whole of Perth or Boorloo in Western Australia. My lands extend as far as Geraldton to the north, Merredin to the northeast, and Esperance to the southeast. The 40,000-year-old Noongar way of life was not consigned to borders before the European invasion of our ancestral lands, nor the subsequent colonisation of Western Australia by Captain James Stirling and his men. The first governor of Western Australia as a colony, Stirling, led a massacre of the Binjareb or Pinjarra people. Not very democratic at all. According to Professor Jane Lyndon, prominent settlers of Western Australia's colonial expansion saw to it that Aboriginal workers were exploited for cheap labour, or often unpaid servitude, that a culture of secrecy and a code of silence was imposed for these practices, which were technically outlawed by the Crown and the British Empire. This code of secrecy has left a legacy of continued violence against Aboriginal women in Western Australia. Noongar elder, healer and historian Uncle Jim Morrison, who worked along with former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with the Stolen Generations Apology, has a dedicated organisation to healing and truth-telling, and has reported on the continued abuse of women and children by the state through policy and other means since invasion. These facts remain largely unaddressed by the policy praxis of the states, the Commonwealth, and the territories administered by the latter. Matters of injustice such as these are systemic, intergenerational, and speak to the trauma of colonial Australia. I also have Nukunu heritage from South Australia, though the custodianship of those people is best told by my family members raised on Nukunu lands, and the waters and the law of their ancestors. I pay respect to my cousin Jared Thomas and our ancestors who are living relatives and the fire safety practices of the ancient homelands of the Nukunu Nation in Port Augusta. If those practices had been abandoned, millions of lives across successive generations could have been lost, along with the resources of the land and its water. My grandfather, a Nukunu man, worked on the Commonwealth Railways and left his home in Port Augusta in South Australia for Kalgoorlie, in Western Australia, where he met my Scottish-Australian grandmother, before serving in the Royal Australian Air Force during the Second World War. I was the youngest co-author of the Uluru Statement from the Heart at the age of 27. That document, the first of its kind for Australia, still bears a message forth to future generations that we, the First Nations people of this continent and its islands adjacent, desire nothing more than to walk alongside other Australians. If all of us are to heal from the injustice, all of us, the past and its corrosive effects on us, then we need to walk as one people in truth and justice. With the defeat of the Australian Indigenous Voice referendum in the October of 2023, I was reminded of every petition to every sovereign king and queen of the United Kingdom across Australia's colonial and post-colonial history. Thus far, the Crown of the United Kingdom has never acknowledged any petition made to them from Indigenous positions or pleas in Australia. Not one. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians continue to suffer from the lowest health and socio-economic outcomes among any distinct group of people in Australia. The closest we've gotten to the Crown acknowledging us was on the date of my 34th birthday, March 6. On this day, I co-hosted Global Citizen with Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, who apologised to First Nations Australians and offered an acknowledgement of country after I spoke the following words. I'm inviting everybody around the world to hear our voice. We continue to call for constitutional change, structural constitutional reform that can empower our people. For as long as the crown of Terra Nullius remains in our constitution, we cannot advance or move forward as a nation. Voiceless in our own lands for generations, I'm now calling on First Nations Australians and our allies to speak up, to have a voice in our families, our communities, and our schools, and our workplaces, until such a time may come when we have a real voice to government. This thesis is one voice, my voice, but I have chosen to make it relevant to the voices of the many. If I'm to have a voice, I choose freely to make my voice one for others who cannot speak or who have not been given the opportunity to do so. In Australia, the Commonwealth Government overwhelmingly decides and determines the nature of legislation and policy for Australians because of the federal constitutional arrangement with the states and territories. Because of the federal nature of the Commonwealth and the operation of the Constitution as supreme law, a large cohort of First Nations Australians called for a referendum to alter the Commonwealth Constitution, establishing a First Nations advisory voice to Parliament. Those of us who led this charge still maintain, on the whole, that the process would have allowed governments to work alongside First Nations people to agree on policy at the grassroots, within the communities affected by Canberran decision-making. This was not an unusual request, yet the fear infused into the debate by reactive and self-interested parties killed the First Nations voice to Parliament, aided and abetted by the most biased and reactive media climate Australia has ever known. A media so reactive and unethical and dishonest in this time in history that two former Prime Ministers from opposing parties and movements, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, have teamed up to call for a national media inquest, a royal commission. The First Nations voice to Parliament would have made a mutually beneficial arrangement with the Commonwealth and the communities, of which the former had made policies for without the consent of the latter. I believe that this has gone on for far too long in the contemporary world, and I'm far from the only Australian who is of that belief. As I shall remind you in this presentation and preamble to my thesis, the architects of the Commonwealth Constitution of 1901 specifically excluded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians at the very act of federation. This was only rectified in 1967 via a large voting majority in a referendum which sought to count First Nations Australians in the Commonwealth census. Sadly, an overwhelming number of Australians who still refuse to accept us as equal in our right to self-determination voted no in 2023, just as they had done in the 1999 Australian Republic referendum. The biggest issue with the 1999 referendum was its model, and we've spoken about that recently. This is why we're having such an important discussion about the models proposed. An oligarchy is an exclusive group of people who directly control a nation, while aristocracies are those of a higher class who tend to rule or benefit from systems such as monarchies. Oligarchs do not have to be of any higher class background to govern with the interests, their own interests, over those of the majority. The 1999 referendum's republic model was objectively a proposal for an oligarchy. Elected politicians would have handpicked candidates for president with no consent from you or I as everyday Australians. Then they would have voted in Parliament for one of their hand-picked presidents, giving a slightly more democratic layer to the pool of persons normally distinguished as candidates for the role of Governor-General. Statistically, besides members of the royal family or British aristocrats, these have mostly been white Protestant males from wealthier suburbs, not dissimilar to the criteria for King or Queen of the United Kingdom. Those who believe that Australia is already fully independent from Britain should view the recent High Court of Australia ruling, where Professor Jenny Hocking took on Buckingham Palace and won in a bid to view letters pertaining to an Australian Prime Minister's dismissal. The secretary to the late Queen Elizabeth II denied all involvement in the dismissal, yet the letters withheld from public view proved otherwise. How can Australia, which does not trust itself with its own sense of sovereignty, trust us as First Nations Australians with our own? We, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, overwhelmingly supported the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the proposed First Nations voice to Parliament, yet composing only a smaller proportion of the population, the trust in our aspirations was placed in the hands of other Australians. How could the rest of Australia vote no to something which would have made a progressive start to healing our divided nation? How could people fall for the negative media rhetoric of other nations seeping into our national affairs, and how could the perpetrators get away with it? These are questions which motivated me at the beginning of my thesis, and if anything, I have more questions. I've lost months of sleep over the past decade alone thinking about these questions and other ones. However, I remain focused on the scope of my thesis, the proposition of a model of governance and self-determination for all Australians. Professor Shireen Morris, who Daniel introduced when he spoke earlier, put forward a proposal for a declaration of recognition in the Constitution of Australia in 2020. Now the First Nations voice has been defeated, it is apparent that we, the Australian people, must have a declaration of independence from the Crown if we are to make the necessary steps to revisit and deliver the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full across the next decade. For those around the world who may be listening and who do not understand, Australia remains to this day a constitutional monarchy. We, the Australian people, have no directly elected executive power, and His Majesty King Charles III is Australia's head of state as heir successor to the late Queen Elizabeth II. This is so because of the federation of former Crown colonies, now states and territories of the Commonwealth of Australia from 1901. Australia became a nation in the modern world, yet in this contemporary global situation, objectively not without social, economic and security risks to Australians daily, we remain constitutionally bound to the United Kingdom, and the Crown remains the law in our courts. It adorns the shoulders of our military personnel and our police, because in no mere symbolic way at all, the Crown reigns with supreme constitutional authority over all separations of government powers, as well as other extensions of the state, through an inherited privilege and not by the merit of any elected person in Australia. It must be said objectively from the available literature of which scholarship is ultimately judged, that those who have led in the space of constitutional republican thought have done so with an apparent temerity in their visionless and unsophisticated rhetoric, leaving all First Nations considerations out of the debate, much as the founding Federalists had done to us in the establishment of the Constitution itself in 1901. In the past 7 years of reviewing the literature and arguments from all corners of the constitutional debate, monarchist, republican, and their factions within, I am left with an obvious indication that they overwhelmingly come from the same meta-ignorant mindset of Terra Nullius, indicating that they are not much more enlightened in their imperialism than their British colonial and other European forebears. The very use of the term enlightenment alongside that of colonialism is indication enough of their privilege and insensitivities toward our indigenous civilizations worldwide. Alarmingly, each of them has failed to honour, respect, or highlight the significances of our histories, let alone our culture or our traditions, in any constitutional framework thus far. In so many ways, beyond the outcome of the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum, we are not included in any path forward. Despite this, I engage with the best of their ideas where they have merit, alongside other First Nations scholars in this thesis. It is far too easy to exclusively criticise ideas one does not adhere to, and thereby miss the important commonalities and strengths. However, when most ideas fall short of something as important as First Nations sovereignty and self-determination in the space of constitutional restitution of any kind, it can become quite exhausting. We as First Nations scholars grow tired of having to explain to non-Indigenous scholars why ignoring us in the debate is insulting. However, all of us, whether we like it or not, are bound by the supreme law of the Commonwealth Constitution, even First Nations Australians as of 1967. Therefore, understanding its nuances is critical. It must be said, however, that there was far more First Nations constitutional scholarship to cover throughout the study of constitutional transformation for Australia, nothing exclusively Republican yet, but certainly related to more effective notions of statehood, encompassing the emerging understanding of a land which owns itself. Professor Megan Davis was a key co-author of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and was always sceptical of a simplistic recognition in the Commonwealth Constitution. Professor Davis has always looked to the weaknesses in our Constitution, the racism and the outmoded elements. Professor Davis was also involved in the 1999 Republic referendum. We, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians, cannot discriminate between most non-Indigenous scholars or persons of vested authority, nor the Protestant or the Catholic, still apparently feuding over their own issues from Europe. We refuse to discriminate between the English or the Irish Australian, nor their institutions. They are equal in their handiwork in eroding and dominating our lives. Even today, as we remain the most incarcerated people on the planet, with health and socio-economic outcomes which should appeal to their apparent shared cause for social justice, we cannot discriminate between them because in our eyes, and from our collective position, as a colonised and subjugated people at their hands, all are collectively guilty of eroding our Indigenous sovereignties at some point in the story of what remains the Kingdom of Australia and its constitutional monarchy. Perhaps this is why they are so silent when it comes to matters of injustice in Australia. I'm driven to investigate the problems of the arbitrary nature of our Commonwealth constitutional system of government and the lack of political voice among all Australians therein. Surely all of us are equally capable of restitution and for the injustices of our ancestors, because all of our ancestors have committed injustices. And surely each of us is capable of unity today. Moving forward, even in the aftermath of the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum, and a quarter of a century after the failed Oligarchs' Republic referendum, I have always maintained that healing can begin with a simple commitment to the reconciliation, truth and justice of Australia and all coming generations of Australians, of her lands, her peoples and her cultures. In fact, it has been my most consistent claim in the matter of constitutional transformation thus far. And to quote the Uluru Statement from the Heart itself, we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. I also believe that we as one people can take a strong stand against the injustice in a hereditary system of government and its notion of invested power, which is often an important yet forgotten part of the debate about republics versus monarchies. Greg Craven addresses this briefly while putting to bed most of the superfluous reactive arguments on all sides of the debate. The overwhelming truth to the last of the monarchists who hold close to an imitation aristocracy in Australia is this: the world has consistently discarded the hair shirt of monarchy and its totalitarian cousin, embracing instead the meritocracy and freedom of direct democracy, which Daniel also just spoke about. Nations are built on these principles and they stand the test of time. These republics exist among our strongest allies, among other Commonwealth nations, and within our own Indo-Pacific region. Reactive monarchists, such as David Flint and former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, often remind us that a few republics around the world are problematic. Flint and Abbott should rise to maturely accept that there are absolutist monarchies in our world and totalitarian dictatorships, which no sensible Australian Republican would ever compare to the Australian Crown. I have no time for reactive rhetoric, and I refuse to allow it to permeate the way forward any longer. Reactive arguments are conceived to shut down debate and to further ensure that no one else gets a say. Quite simply, the Australian Crown is an arbitrary anachronism out of place among a nation which has never had a serious landed aristocracy to uphold it. And of course, the late Sir Henry Parkes, a former colonial governor of Australia and founding federalist, coined the term dung heap aristocracy to directly criticise the madness of it in Australia founded on work and industry, rather than a false class structure of a privileged few. Everything established above and without the consent of Australian citizens can easily stand unchallenged, and the Crown itself has no regard for our satisfaction with its own system of invested power, which many of the British royal family have flouted onerously and continue to face international scrutiny for today. No one in Australia voted for the royal accession to the throne of their Majesty's Queen Victoria, nor King Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII, George VI, Queen Elizabeth II, or King Charles III. Only the Accession Council of the United Kingdom exercises that privilege, and they are not elected either. No Australian will vote for the now inevitable accession to the same throne of His Majesty King William V, assuming he will take that regnal style when the current sovereign of failing health passes on. However, the accession affects the very nature of Australia's constitutional form of government. I remain immensely displeased with what students in our nation's schools and universities are compelled to learn when they study the Constitution, that they cannot aspire to be head of state, while the document's preamble exists in its current form. Australian students learn that power is held by one person who must be of a particular race, family, higher social class, and Protestant Christian religion. Those words in the preambulatory material of the Commonwealth Constitution enact a supreme legal jurisprudence, which rules with finality in the Judicial High Court of Australia. This fact, at least, will be changed by my research, which will reframe the academic and constitutional debate going forward. Now there will be research which challenges the system. My thesis, titled Australian Republic, A Constitution for Australia's Lands, Peoples and Cultures, explores two specific movements of constitutional transformation for Australia. A model for an Australian Republic, conditional on a directly elected head of state replacing the sovereignty of the Crown. B, an enshrined constitutional voice for and acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians in the Commonwealth Constitution. Continuing the call for these measures after this thesis is complete presents opportunities as well as challenges, especially now. As on a research journey in sovereignty and self-determination for Australians across coming generations, I am of the belief that a lack of civic empowerment and education on the part of governments, combined with a limited opportunity for Australians to participate in their representative democracy beyond a general election, does nothing for resolving the immense distrust that Australians place in their constitutional system of government. One thing observed in the 1999 and 2023 referenda is that most Australians do not know their constitution. Even the reactive no campaigners who swear to uphold and protect it, apparently unaware that we have High Court justices appointed to do that, and even still, the stipulation that we may have referenda means that changes to it were always conceived by its draftspeople. However, the British mercantile law of Australian colonists in the 19th century and their mindset of terra nullius has continued its ill-spirited laws and policies despite the High Court of Australia's decision to overrule its specific legal foothold in the 1990s. Australia was not no one's land then, and it's certainly not no one's land now. And so the past, present, and future of terra nullius is completely illogical and baseless beyond its complicated legal deliberations. Indeed, legally baseless in its etymological praxis and agenda, a truth from history often untold is that the proclamation of terra nullius was conceived to directly obstruct the first attempt at a treaty between British migrants and First Nations Australians pre-Federation, the Bateman Treaty. Similarly, the No campaign in the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum appealed to the same division and disunity of this ill spirit of terra nullius. I just want to finish by saying that I believe that the only social contract where a person should have power over another person's life is served by the learned judge who should see beyond anything which may differentiate us and who should see only what equates us under the law. Also, the physician who should care for the fragility of humanity with dignity and respect, trained to do so, unassuaged by circumstance and challenged to strive for the preservation of human life. The ethical driver behind the judge and the physician reemerges from time to time in almost every other role in society. The ethics of the freedom of the individual to live without domination and unnecessary hindrances or interferences. That the quality and duration of their life must be upheld above all else. Where are these ethics among the decision makers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians across history, whose lives have depended on their decisions, the decisions of other men, in ways which have eluded our consent for generations? Many of us understand that the freedom to make our own decisions with the right support from the Commonwealth is the only way to make and improve our outcomes. Where what has been attempted thus far has not suited us, there has never been such a time as this to begin anew. Too many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations Australians are still dying of diseases which are completely preventable, and many have a shorter life expectancy than other Australians. This isn't symbolism, it's real. This thesis sits as a part of an intergenerational governance strategy model which I have developed in my approach to political philosophy in the past decade. An apparent refusal of Australia's executive power to resolve First Nations injustice, let alone provide more of a voice for constituents for their self-government, freedom and independence, draws Australia's executive power into our scrutiny. Does Australia truly have executive power if this is the case? Australia has no office of power and representation above federally elected Commonwealth ministers who choose their Prime Minister with no direct decision from electors. Without a voice for all Australians to executive government and without a voice for First Nations Australians. Politicians will continue to make decisions for us with only partial consent and sometimes none. As it stands, Australia has no directly elected executive government. Some around the world are not remotely aware that His Majesty King Charles III is head of state by birthright. Governors-General parade ornately in an inconsequential role somewhere between the interests of the Prime Minister who appoints them and the sovereign they are supposed to be representing, a royal proxy in what some see as an antipodean outpost rather than a sovereign independent nation. The only people Australians vote for in their Commonwealth elections apart from members of Parliament are Australian senators. If Australia is to progress as a nation, there must be sovereignty and self-determination among all the Australian people, and the argument that Australians should not govern themselves is one I have never had any entertainment for. A directly elected president as a first among equals has merit among those who such a leader serves. A sovereign who rules by birthright from a foreign nation can never have the power nor the respect to advance Australia. Thank you.